Can willpower and self-control be enhanced with practice or environmental feedback? There already exist exercise regimens for training control of the mind that have remarkable effects on brain function, attentional control, and how one reacts to events that arise externally in the world or internally in the mind. Various meditation techniques involve paying attention to something pretty boring like the breath, or a sound, a mantra, or a picture, a mandala. Each time the mind drifts off, one brings it back. I lived in a monastery once for 3 months as a young man, and I can tell you how hard it was just to stay focused on my breath. I initially felt that my mind was out of control, jumping immediately to this money problem or to that attraction to some girl or to that old resentment. I went to the head monk, basically telling him what a piece of garbage I felt that my mind was, and through a translator, he told me that the mind is like a wild monkey. He said, "You say, 'Sit, monkey,' and don't move, and as soon as you stop paying attention, the monkey then jumps off to climb around the many rooms of the mind." He said, "If you gently and non-judgmentally bring the monkey back to sit down thousands of times, eventually the monkey will stay put and your consciousness will start to transform." Before talking about its mental effects, let's talk about some of its physical effects. Meditation and breathing techniques may evoke parasympathetic dominance. One goal of such techniques appears to be the gaining of volitional attentional control over the emotions and physiology, probably via learning involving lateral prefrontal and parietal circuitry, which, through practice, come to better govern the ACC sympathetic-parasympathetic axis. Scientists have to date generally focused on the deep relaxation and feelings of well-being that can follow certain meditative techniques. There are, however, other techniques designed to elicit sympathetic rather than parasympathetic responses. For example, some schools of yoga, such as Kundalini Yoga, have exercises that involve punching the air with intentionally evoked anger, as well as exercises that involve contracting the abdomen and anal sphincter in a controlled manner, in each case followed by relaxation and focus on the breath. These are the muscular and breathing responses associated with sympathetic response. Invoking them in this volitional and controlled way may bring these usually automatic or autonomic fight or flight responses under better volitional and cognitive control. Training in numerous schools of the martial arts involved repeated controlled punching and fighting, and was developed in Buddhist monasteries as a mental, spiritual, and emotional practice as much as a physical means of self-defense. So the Western view that meditation is primarily about relaxation is really incomplete. The goal is not relaxation per se, but mastery of the mind and nervous system, with particular emphasis on increasing the attentional system's range and depth of volitional control. With mastery, one can turn the body into a powerful whip of determination, or as needed, into a calm pond of inner serenity. In all these Eastern traditions, attention to breathing is considered central to mastering one's mind. Since sympathetic and parasympathetic patterns of response typically involve stereotypical patterns of breathing, some argue that bringing the pattern of breathing under volitional attentional control affords a mechanism for gaining greater control over the autonomic nervous system. If certain mental states, such as fear and panic, or relaxation, are associated with stereotypical breathing patterns, the idea is that volitionally invoking these same breathing patterns can help one gain volitional control over the associated mental states. For an animal to be able to function, it has to sometimes be active in order to eat, escape, fight, mate, care for the young, and so on. But at other times, it has to also be inactive so that it can heal, digest, sleep, and recharge its batteries of energy. So a balance must be struck between the right hemisphere's sympathetic tendency toward energy expenditure in the pursuit of goals and the left hemisphere's parasympathetic tendency toward energy conservation in the pursuit of rest and vegetative functions such as digestion. This balancing appears to involve phylogenetically ancient central pattern-generating circuits in the vagal complex of the brainstem that regulate respiration and patterns of vocalization, probably because vocalization and respiration must be coordinated. Although alien to a Western conception of the mind and body, the notion of willpower is tied to a physical location in yoga, namely the Manipura chakra, behind the solar plexus. This is also true in the martial arts, where willpower and the power to act are localized in the same area of the abdomen called hara in Japanese. When I studied Shotokan karate years ago, one of the strongest compliments you could pay someone was to say they had strong hara. Yogic martial arts and meditative exercises train mental control of this region using breathing and muscle contraction in the belief that training volitional control over this area can lead to strengthened willpower and psychological strength. In the West, we colloquially refer to someone as having a fire in the belly when they're very determined, or having guts when they're courageous. Perhaps different cultures have independently come to the conclusion that the solar plexus plays some special role in the exertion of will. Even though Hindu, Buddhist, and traditional Chinese conclusions are rooted in very different assumptions than Western science, some of their discoveries and conclusions were rooted in empirical observation. Unlike Western science, emphasis was not placed on observation of the external world, but instead on observation of the internal world of experience. Body function and health are domains where both phenomenological Eastern and scientific Western systems of observation have created complex models. It would be dogmatic to dismiss Eastern systems out of hand. Certainly, when people exert cognitive, emotional, or physical effort to overcome some obstacle, they tend to knit their brows, hold or constrict their breath, and contract the muscles of the abdomen, diaphragm, and anal sphincter. This appears to be an innate human response that accompanies effortful willing, which may reflect a general preparedness for action, fighting, or resistance as a result of sympathetic nervous system arousal. It's likely no coincidence that behind what is colloquially called the solar plexus or breadbasket lies a large plexus of nerves called the solar plexus or celiac plexus. Here's a 1918 figure from Gray's Anatomy showing where it is. It's comprised of the left and right splanchnic nerves, which carry both sympathetic fight-or-flight efferent fibers that innervate the viscera and visceral sensory afferent fibers, parts of the right vagus nerve carrying motor parasympathetic rest and digest fibers to the viscera, and sensory afferent neurons carrying information about the viscera to the brain, and the celiac ganglia, which are parts of the sympathetic nervous system and the largest ganglia in the autonomic nervous system. Axons from neurons in these ganglia innervate virtually the entire viscera. These neuronal connections are key in regulating the degree of fight or flight versus rest and digest operation in the body. You can see that each organ receives parasympathetic innervation, shown as fine lines here, and also receives sympathetic innervation, shown in thick lines here, and can be thought of as the brakes and the gas pedal governing the activity of our body. While the cortex can influence the responses of the celiac plexus, these responses operate with a degree of autonomy, thus the name autonomic nervous system. One might think of the celiac plexus as one of the two brains or integration and control centers of the autonomic nervous system, the other being the enteric nervous system embedded in the gastrointestinal lining, which makes decisions about enzyme release involved in digestion, as well as motor control of the gut, including peristalsis and movements that churn food. The enteric nervous system has more neurons than the entire spinal cord, about 100 million, and uses many of the same neurotransmitters. It's this second brain in our gut that likely gives rise to gut feelings, whose encephalized cortical center is likely the anterior insula or frontal operculum, just as the ACC plays this role for the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. It's likely not a coincidence that the cingulo-opercular control network links cognition with fine control of the body via both aspects of the peripheral nervous system, namely sympathetic-parasympathetic via the ACC and enteric via the frontal operculum, so that tasks can be completed as planned while invoking appropriate body states. If the Eastern traditions are correct, how and why would training cortical control of the celiac plexus train willpower in the specific sense of voluntary control over the application of sympathetic and parasympathetic responses? The answer might lie in the realization that emotions and physiological responses are causally intertwined. Although it's common to think that emotions cause physiological responses, the James Lange theory argues the opposite, namely that emotions tend to follow physiological responses. On this account, the autonomic nervous system takes causal precedence, reacting to experiences of the world, which then trigger physiological arousal states that are then interpreted, in turn triggering emotional responses. As William James formulated it, the James-Lange theory is too strong, I think, and cannot be correct. On the other hand, the alternative view formulated in the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion, that emotional and physiological responses are evoked together with causal precedence given to emotion, also has its flaws. A reasonable compromise is that there are two interacting systems, one emotional and the other physiological, that interact continuously, making claims of causal precedence pointless. If emotion and physiology are normally not dissociable, but two interacting semi-autonomous modes of processing input, then causality should work both ways. If true, then it is not unreasonable to assume that intentionally changing one's physiology can change one's emotional state. One sees such causation in so-called laughter yoga, where you force yourself to laugh artificially, then find that you feel happier and are genuinely laughing. Here's a funny clip showing people doing this. But training of the solar plexus in yoga and the martial arts is more ambitious than just having the goal of making us feel better. The claim is that by mastering and cultivating control over the solar plexus, one gains inner strength, psychological and emotional resilience, and willpower. If certain exercises do indeed train cognitive control over the sympathetic nervous system's central integration center, namely the solar plexus, then it seems reasonable that sympathetic nervous system response can itself come under greater cognitive control. Rather than automatically entering a fearful or aggressive state, one gains volitional control over the application of these states. Without the cognitive control of a cortical rider, the autonomic horses might run wild or at least be on autopilot. By releasing and reining in sympathetic and parasympathetic responses at will, acts of cognitive willing gain control of the emotions, particularly fear and aggression, and the physiological responses required for exerting one's will, so to speak, volitionally, rather than reflexively or on autopilot.